Guys, so yesterday we started reading our Frindle story and we learned all about Nick and how he's kind of a prankster and he's heading into the fifth grade with Miss Granger, who loves the dictionary. Let's find out what happens next. Chapter 3, The Question. The first day of school was always a get acquainted day. Books were passed out and there was a lot of chatter. Everyone asked, "What did you do over the summer?" Periods 1 through 6 went by very smoothly for Nick. Then came period 7. So periods are like new chunks of time. So since they have different teachers for different classes, they have periods. So it's like after 45 minutes, you might go to a new teacher. Mrs. Granger's class was all business. The first thing they did was take a vocabulary pretest to see how many of the 35 words for the week the kids already knew. Tremble, circular, orchestra, the list went on and on. Nick knew most. Then there was a handout about class procedures. After that, there was a review paper about cursive writing, and then there was a sample sheet showing how the heading should look on every assignment. No let up for 37 minutes straight. Nick was an expert at asking the delaying question, also known as the teacher stopper or the guaranteed time waster. At 3 minutes before the bell, in that split second between the end of today's classwork and the announcement of tomorrow's homework, Nick could launch a question guaranteed to sidetrack the teacher long enough to delay or even wipe out the homework assignment. Timing was important, but asking the right question, that was the hard part. Questions about stuff in the news, questions about the college the teacher went to, questions about the teacher's favorite book, sport, or hobby. Nick knew all the tricks, and he had been very successful in the past. Here he was in fifth grade, near the end of the very first language arts class with Mrs. Granger, and Nick could feel a homework assignment come in the way a farmer can feel a rainstorm. Mrs. Granger paused to catch her breath, and Nick's hand shot up. She glanced down at her seating chart and then up at him. Her sharp gray eyes were not even turned up to half power. "Yes, Nicholas?" "Mrs. Granger, you have so many dictionaries in this room, and that huge one especially. Where did all those words come from? Did they just get copied from other dictionaries? It sure is a big book." It was a perfect thought grenade. Kapow! Several kids smiled, and a few peeked at the clock. Nick was famous for this, and the whole class knew what he was doing. Unfortunately, so did Miss Granger. She hesitated a moment and gave Nick a smile that was just a little too sweet to be real. Her eyes were the color of a thundercloud. Ooh, a simile. "Why, what an interesting question, Nicholas. I could talk about that for hours, I bet." She glanced around the classroom. "Do the rest of you want to know too?" Everybody nodded. "Very well then, Nicholas. Will you do some research on this subject and give a little oral report to the class? If you find out the answer yourself, it will mean so much more than if I just told you. Please have your report ready for our next class." So instead of him delaying homework, what happened? He got extra homework, huh? Mrs. Granger smiled at him again, very sweetly. Then it was back to business. "Now, the homework for tomorrow can be found on page 12 of your Words Alive book." Nick barely heard the assignment. His heart was pounding. He felt small, very small. He could feel the tops of his ears glowing red. A complete shutdown, an extra assignment, and probably a little black mark next to his name on the seating chart. Everything he had heard about this teacher was true. Don't mess around with the Lone Ranger. 4-word detective. It was a beautiful September afternoon, bright sun, cool breeze, blue skies. Not for Nick. He had to do a little report for the next day, plus copy all the definitions for 35 words for Mrs. Granger. This was not the way school was supposed to work, not for Nick. There was a rule at Nick's house: homework first, and that meant right after school. Nick had heard his older brother James groan and grumble about this rule for years, right up until he graduated from high school 2 years ago. And then James rode away from college after his first semester and said, "My grades are looking great because when I came here, I already knew how to put first things first." That letter was the proof Nick's mom and dad had been looking for. Homework first was the law from September to June. Here's Nick doing some homework. Homework first. This had never bothered Nick before because he hardly ever had homework. Oh, sure, he looked over his spelling words on Thursday nights, and had been a few short book reports in fourth grade. Other than that, nothing. Up to now, schoolwork never spilled over into his free time. Thanks to Mrs. Granger, those days were gone. First, he looked up the definitions in the brand new red dictionary that his mom had brought because Miss Granger told her to. It took almost an hour. He could hear a baseball game in John's yard down the street, yelling and shouting, and every few minutes, the sharp crack of a bat connecting with the pitch. But he had a report to do for Mrs. Granger. Nick looked at the very front of the dictionary. There was an introduction to the book called Words and Their Origins. Perfect, Nick thought. It was just what he needed to do. It was just what he needed to do his report. It would all be over in a few minutes. Nick could already feel the sun and breeze on his face as he ran outside to play. Homework all done. Then he read the first sentence from the introduction. Without question, this modern American dictionary is one of the most surprisingly complex and profound documents ever to be created, for it embodies unparalleled etymological detail reflecting not only superb lexicographic scholarship, but also the dreams and speech and imaginative talents of millions of people over thousands of years. For every person who has ever spoken or written in English has had a hand in its making. What? Nick scratched his head and read it again and then again. Not much better. It was sort of like trying to read the ingredients on a shampoo bottle. He slammed the dictionary shut and walked downstairs. Nick's family did a lot of reading, so bookshelves covered 3 or 4 walls in the family room. There were 2 sets of encyclopedias. The black set was for grown-ups and the red set was for the kids. Nick pulled out the D volume from the red set. So an encyclopedia, it's by letter, and each letter goes over everything. So for example, A would teach you about alligators, Alabama, Arkansas, anything that starts with an A, and it'll give you feedback on what it is. Nick pulled out the D from the red set and looked up dictionary. There were 3 full pages with headings like early dictionaries, word detective, and dictionaries today. Not very exciting, but he had to do it. So Nick just plopped down on the couch and read all of it. And when he was finished with the kids' book, he opened up the black encyclopedia and read most of what it said about dictionaries too. He understood only about half of what he read. He leaned back on the couch and covered his eyes with his arms, trying to imagine himself giving a report on all this boring stuff. He'd be lucky to have 3 minutes worth. But because Nick was Nick, he suddenly had an idea, and it brought a grin to his face. Nick decided that giving this report could actually be fun. He could make it into something special. After all, Miss Granger had asked for it. All right, one more chapter. 5. The report. By lunchtime the next day, Nick had a bad feeling in the pit of his stomach. 7th period was coming. He was going to have to stand up in front of Miss Granger's class. The eyes of everyone in the class would be glued to his face, and Mrs. Granger's eyes would be cranked up to their maximum power. He looked over his notes again and again. First English dictionary, the growth of the English language, William Shakespeare, words from French and German, new words, new inventions, Anglo, Saxon words, Latin and Greek words, roots, American English, it all became a big jumble in his mind. And his grand plan from the night before, in the harsh fluorescent light of the school day, it seemed impossible. What is it with the clocks in school? When you're planning to go to the carnival after school, the clocks in every class practically run backward. and the school day lasts for about 3 weeks. But if you have to go to the barber or go shopping for clothes after school, zip, the whole day is over before you can blink. And today, after lunch, periods 5 and 6 went by in 2 ticks. As the seventh period bell rang, Mrs. Granger walked into the classroom, took 4 steps to her desk at the side of the room, flipped open her attendance book, glanced out at the class, and made 2 little check marks. Then, looking up at Nick, she said, "I think we have a little report to begin our class today. Nicholas?" 15 seconds into seventh period, and Nick was on stage. This lady plays for keeps, thought Nick. He gulped, grabbed his crumpled note cards and his book bag, and walked to the front of the room. He stood next to the giant dictionary on its little table. Mrs. Granger walked to the back of the classroom and sat primly on a tall stool next to the bookcase. She was wearing her blue uniform. Taking a deep breath, Nick began. "Well, the first thing I learned is that the first English dictionary," Miss Granger interrupted. "Excuse me, Nicholas, but does your report have a title?" Nick looked blankly at her. "A title? No, I didn't make a title. Class, please remember to include a title whenever you prepare an oral or written report. Now, please go on, Nicholas." And she smiled and nodded him. Nick began again. Looking right at Miss Granger, he said, "The dictionary." A couple of kids thought that was funny. Nick played it straight and just kept talking. "A lot of people think that the first English dictionary was put together in the 1700s by a man named Samuel Johnson. He lived in London, England. He was real smart and he wrote a lot of books, and he wanted all the other smart people to have a good dictionary to use, so he made one. But there were other dictionaries before his. The thing that was different about Johnson's dictionary was its size, first of all. He had over 43,000 words in it." The class made a bunch of noise at this big number. "Ooh," and "wow," and stuff like that, and Nick lost his concentration. He glanced up at Mrs. Granger, expecting to see those eyes drilling a hole in him, but they weren't. They were almost friendly in a teachery kind of way. She shushed the class and said, "Go on, Nicholas, that's a fine beginning." Nick almost smiled, but he saw all the kids staring at him, so he gripped his note cards even tighter and jumped back in. The other thing that Samuel Johnson did that was special was to choose the words he thought were most important, and then give lots of examples showing how the words got used by people. For example, he showed how the word take could be used in 113 different ways. Nick's report went on smoothly for 12 minutes. Nick was surprised at how easy it was to stand there and talk about this stuff. At the end of the first 5 minutes, Mrs. Granger had to stop Nick and sit again to say, "Class, it's not good manners to yawn out loud or to put your heads down on your desk when someone is giving an oral report." Do you think that his classmates are finding this interesting? No one in the class cared one little bit about the report, except Mrs. Granger. Every time Nick glanced up, she was smiling, and her eyes were not the least bit icy or sharp. She was eating this stuff up, listening and nodding, and every once in a while she would say, "Very good point," and "Yes, that's exactly right." But the next time Nick looked up, he saw Mrs. Granger sneaking a look at her watch. 18 minutes gone. Maybe his idea was going to work after all. Time for phase 2. All right, guys, we're going to stop there for today, and we're going to find out what phase 2 is tomorrow.